All right, everybody, welcome. Once again, one more video for this semester. This is just a little review session type video where I'm going to go over many of the different topics that are listed in the second half of the study guide that you guys have got for the final on Thursday next week. So let me go ahead and just get through some of these topics. I'm going to basically go down the list, and I might not give a fully detailed answer, but I'll at least give you a sense of the right kind of content that you'll want to look at in order to, form a good response for that question. So if you have the study guide or if you've been able to gain access to it, it's definitely on Canvas. It's been posted there. You can view, print, or download it anytime to help with your preparation for this final exam. But there's a set of listed questions. The second half of the study guide starts with question 49, and then it continues down until, I guess, 89. So I'm going to basically give brief kind of bullet point information on each of the topics here. And in your own response, you'd probably like to give a more detailed and complete response to anything because they're graded on a 0 through 4 scale. So you want to try to get your maximum score, obviously. But let's just kind of take a good look here. So starting with question 49, it said, explain who, so the first bracket of questions are about Buddhism. So the first one says, explain who Siddhartha Gautama is and why he's significant. So this was an Indian prince who lived about 600 years before the Common Era, and he's widely considered to be the founding figure of the Buddhist religious tradition. In fact, having achieved enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, he's just known as the Buddha. He was born into great wealth and privilege. At one time in his later adulthood, I guess in his later 20s, he escaped the palace walls and he saw sights that we'll talk about in another question, which motivated and inspired him to seek out enlightenment. And then he ended up becoming a traveling teacher and religious scholar who achieved enlightenment while seated under the Bodhi tree. And because of his example and influence, that kind of founds the tradition of Buddhism. Question 50 talks about what are the 4 sights that Siddhartha saw and what were their effect. So as just mentioned, he left the palace walls, the sort of secure, isolated or somewhat sheltered environment that he had grown up in. And when he left, he saw these 4 things that had a major impact on him and his way of thinking about the world. So the 4 sights, quote unquote, are number 1, an old man, number 2, a sick man, number 3, a dying man, and then the 4th one was a wandering ascetic, they call them, a person in search of spiritual enlightenment. So seeing these things awakened him to the reality of loss and suffering, and illuminated for him more clearly the human condition, which involves a struggle to overcome strife, suffering, and hardship. So that's what set him on a path to try and become enlightened, ultimately attaining that enlightenment as the Buddha. The 4 Noble Truths. So in the line of reflection and meditation and teaching that the Buddha took on, he eventually determined that there's 4 basic truths in the world that we need to know in order to make progress to our own enlightenment. So first was that life is suffering, that life and the way that life plays out involves suffering and perpetual suffering. The second is the truth about the nature of suffering, what causes it. And it's claimed that suffering is caused by desire, by attachment to desires, and the frustration that we feel sometimes when our desires are not satisfied or met. And the third truth is the truth of how to escape suffering, which is to eliminate desire. So to cease suffering, to the cessation of suffering, we would have to eliminate our desires. And then the 4th truth is the truth of the path, which talks about how we can attain enlightenment and cause our desires to cease, and thereby for our suffering to cease, if we follow an 8-fold path, which includes a lot of points that we'll discuss in the next question here. So the Noble Eightfold Path is the path by which a person is told that they can attain enlightenment. So let me just quickly give you information about the Eightfold Path. I want to make sure that I don't miss any of the steps. So going back to the source here. I know them generally offhand, but I want to make sure that I give them in the proper order and sequence. Actually, I think an easier resource is to use our Houston Smith book. Okay, so for the Eightfold Path, we should attain to these 8 things to try and make our best progress towards enlightenment. One is right views, having the right views about things in the world and about society and yourself. The second is right intent, to always make sure that your intentions are pure and righteous. The third is right speech, to make sure that you always speak rightly in a way that doesn't involve hate, that you're always charitable and honest. Then there's right conduct, that is to make sure that you always act in a way that's generous and involved with the well-being of other sentient beings. For example, not to steal, lie, kill, to be unchaste, or to drink intoxicating beverages. There's fifth, right livelihood, which means to have a good and noble occupation. The sixth is right effort, to make sure that you always try to give the right intensity and effort to the tasks and important goals that you have. The seventh is right mindfulness, which means to always be conscientious and respectful of others and to be mindful of the situations that you're in. And then the eighth one is right concentration, which is the ability to bring the right type of focus and presence to each activity and action that you undertake. So those are the Noble Eightfold Path. If I could just say them one last time in brief. We said right views, right intent, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Okay, so just some points on that. Next question talks about what are celestial Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So in Buddhism, especially in the Mahayana sect of Buddhism, when a person has already made all this progress towards their own enlightenment, and they could potentially achieve nirvana, or the state of ending the cycle of rebirth. There are some who delay their ultimate ascension to the state of nirvana and remain in a kind of celestial realm where they can continue to assist others on their pathway towards enlightenment. So the celestial bodhisattvas are these like future Buddhas, another way they're sometimes referred to, because they're already basically at the doorstep of their own nirvana, but they wait a little while so that they can act as these kind of like quasi deity figures that can extend grace to others that are trying to make progress on their own path to enlightenment. And a celestial Buddha is an even more powerful version of the celestial bodhisattva, who again delays their ultimate ascension to the state of nirvana in order to extend grace to others. So these figures in the Mahayana tradition are the closest thing in Buddhism to like godlike or deity figures, even though they're still human beings that have just made great steps towards enlightenment. They kind of become invested with somewhat supernatural powers and the ability to intercede and to give grace to people that are trying to make their own steps towards that enlightenment. So that's the celestial Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. The concept of nirvana, very important concept in Buddhist tradition. This is the state at which one achieves enlightenment and ceases to be reborn. So that's the ultimate goal or objective of Buddhist religious thought. Nirvana, in one translation of it, is interpreted as blowing out, like the blowing out of a candle or flame. And you can think about the soul and its ability to maintain, or I should say, perpetuate this cycle of rebirth and death. When that stops happening, it's kind of like blowing out a candle. The being ceases to exist and somehow just becomes merged together with a more fundamental reality. So that's what nirvana is, and it's the ultimate end goal of all of the religious practice of Buddhism. Across many lives, one pursues nirvana, and when they finally do attain that, then they cease rebirth. Okay, so another concept in Buddhism: what is the difference between the Buddha's form body and his Dharma body? So the Dharma body of Buddha is thought to be the set of teachings and principles that he's left behind in the world, which people practice by reading Buddhist texts and investing their lives in the pursuit of enlightenment. So it's just a collection of teachings and ideas. That's what we call the Dharma body of the Buddha. Dharma is a sort of originally Indian word which refers to law and truth. So it's like a set of principles and concepts that are internal to Buddhism that are recorded and sent down through the generations in a written form and through an oral form as well. The form body of Buddha is thought to be the actual physical remains of the Buddha that have been placed in different funerary mounds at different religious sites, some of which are considered to have great religious significance within Buddhism. So the places where the, I guess, cremated remains of various parts of the Buddha remain are called the form body. So that's like the physical body that remains of the Buddha in the world, and the Dharma body is his teachings. Between these two things, it is somewhat thought in the tradition that the Buddha remains in the world to give guidance and instruction to others, both through the teachings that he left behind and also through the sort of physical connection that he has to us with these funerary mounds where his remains exist. Okay, next, Zen Buddhism. Explain it by referring to the concept of Zazen, Koan, and Sanzen. Okay, so what are these three things? First of all, Zazen is like seated meditation, when you get into the lotus position and you try to clear your mind of all thought in order to allow the Buddha mind to permeate through your consciousness so that you can take more steps towards your enlightenment. Sometimes it's thought in Zen Buddhism that language and logic can prevent us from liberating the mind from the attachments that we have and preventing us from attaining enlightenment. So Zazen is a practice of seated and quiet, focused meditation. Koan, in a literal translation, means problem, but it's sort of like these little mysterious riddles that a Zen Buddhist master or guru would issue to a follower in order to preoccupy their mind for a while and to force them to kind of grapple with the limitations of language and logic. So, you know, weird questions like, what's the sound of one hand clapping, or such like, these could be considered koans. They're supposed to occupy the person's mind for a long time, struggling with the somewhat paradoxical or contradictory nature of the question. And that is supposed to help us to, again, break free of the constraints that language and logic imposes on our abilities to pursue our own enlightenment. And then Sanzen is working with a Zen master that helps to guide you through practices of meditation and teaching. So consultation with a Zen master is the third of those terms, Sanzen. Okay, the 6 causes of dukkha. So dukkha is the word within Buddhism that refers to the suffering that all sentient beings experience. And it's argued in some traditions that there are a couple of basic causes of that suffering. So I'm going to tell you what they are. Just give me a minute because I have a good reference to that here in my text. 6 causes of suffering. Yeah, so the 6 causes include these. The first is the trauma of birth, the suffering involved in the process of being born. As you know, little babies are born into the world crying and upset. So I guess one of the big traumas or sources of suffering in life is birth itself. The second is sickness, experiencing sickness or ill health. As you know, this is another primary cause of suffering in life. A third is aging and losing vitality over the course of one's life. So, of course, it's a bit of a painful experience to lose your youth and vitality as you age on. That's the third. The fourth is death, the suffering of death, but really the fear of death and the phobia of anticipating death. And then the fifth source of suffering is to be attached to what you dislike, to be forced to endure attachment or to be tied together with something that you don't want. And the sixth is to be separated from what you love, to be taken away from or removed from something that you love or a condition that you love, whether it's a person or a state. So those are the 6 causes of dukkha or suffering. Now we get to the Chinese religious traditions and concepts. Question 58 asks about to explain the Chinese religious concept of qi and yin yang. So in Chinese religious traditional cosmology, there's this vital substance that sort of forms all the things that exist, and it's called qi. So qi is like this universal substance that all things are composed of. And it's argued that qi manifests as 2 basic forces. So we have qi, and then it is expressed in these 2 different forces. There's yang and yin. So yang energy is masculine, and yin energy is feminine. I could give you a couple of more facts about the basic differences between the 2 types. So yang energy is, let me get this proper, bright, dry, growing, warm, hard, and masculine. And yin energy is dark, moist, cold, soft, and feminine. So cold, soft, feminine, yin, and hard, warm, masculine, yang. And all things, according to this way of thinking, all things are comprised out of various combinations of yin and yang. Okay. Next, the Taoist concept of Wu Wei. So in Taoism, which is one of the major Chinese and Asian religious traditions, we have this idea that you should not interfere with nature and with the flow of nature, which some call the Wei or the Tao. So non-interference in the Tao means allowing things to flow and work as they will without you trying to interfere or interrupt their sort of cosmic purpose or function. So the concept of the mandate of heaven, the next question. In Chinese religious traditional thought, it is believed that the world of the spirits and gods can confer legitimacy on a ruler of a society or can undermine their legitimacy by withdrawing this mandate. So the mandate of heaven is like when there's a ruler that's approved of by the gods, then the gods allow them to rule without interfering in the world. But when they're doing their job poorly and not managing the society in the way that they ought to, or they're not fit to rule, then the gods will show their wrath and they'll withdraw the mandate of heaven by imposing like natural disasters and social strife that might lead to the leader being deposed or removed. So the mandate of heaven is kind of like this idea that there's a check against the power of the secular authorities. If the gods disapprove, then they would make that clear through the withdrawal of their mandate. So Pure Land Buddhism. One sect or version of Buddhism that's known is Pure Land Buddhism, where there's this belief that if you couldn't attain enlightenment in the way through meditation or through knowledge, that sometimes you might need the grace of this celestial Buddha, Amida Buddha. And then if you pray to them and declare your faith in them, especially towards the moment of death, then you would awaken after death in this Pure Land, which is a sort of celestial location that's midway between nirvana and regular Earth. And in the Pure Land, you're freed of some of the hardships, strifes, and distractions that Earth imposes on us. So now you can make more peaceful and calm progress towards your enlightenment within the Pure Land. So it's kind of like a halfway heaven, if you will, but it's easier to ascend to the state of nirvana from the Pure Land. And the grace extended unto you from this Amida Buddha, this celestial Buddha, makes it easier, I guess, than taking the harder path of meditation and self-denial. So that's Pure Land Buddhism. Very popular in a lot of the Chinese religious traditions because of the intercessory power of the Amida Buddha. So we can keep going. The Chinese popular religious practice of shamanism and divination. Shamanism is this traditional practice in the popular Chinese religion, which says that some people are gifted with this sort of supernatural ability to communicate with the dead and with the spirit world. So they can somehow channel into this outside of their body, escape with their soul into the spirit world, communicate with them, and then come back to tell people facts about their life, their fortune, what their deceased relatives are thinking about their lives, and so forth. So it would provide a kind of conduit between reality and the spiritual realm, the shamans, they thought. Divination was another popular traditional practice in Chinese culture and religion, where they thought that by placing a heated rod on, like, say, the shoulder bone of an ox, you'd look at the pattern of cracks that develop from that heated application of the rod, and that would somehow reveal important facts and information about the future, or about the will of the gods, or about your own personal fortunes. So that's the concept of divination, involving oracle bones, as they call these bones that were used for the sake of the practice. Kind of like, think about in Western culture, sometimes people believe in the idea of like fortune telling by reading a person's palm, by looking at the pattern of marks and lines on the hand. So the pattern of lines and marks created on these oracle bones by the heated rod would be something in that same realm in a way. Okay, so we keep going to the next thing, the concept of the celestial bureaucracy. In Chinese religious tradition, in the traditional popular religion, they thought, or they still sometimes think, that there is a celestial bureaucracy which houses all of the various Buddhist and Taoist deity figures, as well as certain cultural heroes that have somehow become members of the celestial bureaucracy as well. So the kind of emphasis on social structure and bureaucratic order extends to Chinese religious thought, because there are sort of ranked hierarchy of these beings that are included in the celestial bureaucracy. So fused together with religious thought is this emphasis on social hierarchy and structure, such that there is a ranked order of deities in the celestial bureaucracy too. Next, the concept of syncretism in the Asian religious traditions. So in the Asian religious traditions, especially in Chinese and Japanese interpretations of them, there's this view in many cases that you don't necessarily have to pick and choose between, like, say, just being Buddhist or being Taoist, or being a Confucian in the Chinese case, because it's argued that all three of these can somehow be fused into one perspective or worldview. So instead of having this kind of exclusivity where you have to basically only practice one set of doctrines or holy texts, instead they somehow want us to think that you can embrace all, and that therefore we synthesize and create a synchronicity between them, hence the term syncretism. That's much different than in the West and in many other cultures, where to be a Muslim is not consistent with being a Christian and vice versa. But in the Chinese religious traditions, there's this embrace of synthesis and cohesion between disparate traditions and fusing them into one cohesive whole. All right. To look at the next question, the concept, explain Confucianism by referring to the concept of Zhao and the 5 constant relationships. So in Confucianism, one of the big emphasis points is this word Zhao, which means filial piety. And in other words, what that refers to is having a sense of devotion, respect, and honor for your family, especially your elders within your family. So to always be a good family member and to adhere to your familial and social duties in those ways. And within that concept, there's also this concept of the 5 constant relationships. So in Confucianism, it's told that we should think about our obligations to one another in terms of the basic relationships that we can stand in with other people socially and within our families. So really quickly, here we go. So the 5 constant relationships are those of father to son, ruler to subject, husband and wife, older brother to younger brother, and then friend to friend. And only the last one there, friend to friend, is considered to be between people of equal rank. In each other case, there's a certain amount of hierarchy. Therefore, there should be deference from the one that's on the inferior side of the relation to the one that's on the more superior side of the relation. So if you are the son, you're supposed to obey the father. And if you're the subject to the ruler, then you're supposed to follow the orders of the ruler, and on with the others. So the idea of these 5 constant relationships, to approach them with filial piety, this gives a sort of basic sense of the essence of, or at least some core aspects of Confucian thought. Next question there has to do with the concepts of the Hun soul and the Po soul. So as we told you just a moment ago, in Chinese religious cosmology, there's Qi, which is manifested as yin and yang. And in accordance with that, the soul is also divided among its yang component and its yin component. So within each one of us, we have kind of 2 souls, one made primarily out of yang energy and one made primarily out of yin energy. So the Hun soul is the one manifested by yang energy, and they say that it ascends at death, and it ultimately comes to reside in these ancestral tablets that are created by the family, where the ancestors will then reside. The Po soul is the yin soul, and because of its cold, dark, and feminine nature, it sinks into the grave to remain with the body. Now, they say that if the burial is not performed properly, or if the death was violent or premature, that sometimes these 2 types of soul will not reach their typical location and would instead haunt the earth and roam around until they are somehow satisfied or reconciled. So that's part of the account of death in the afterlife that's given in popular Chinese religious traditions. Okay, so now we go to the Japanese religious traditions and some questions about it. Number 67 asks about the Shinto concept of kami. So kami is the idea of spirits, and this is a fundamental precept within the Japanese traditional religion of Shinto. So kami are thought to be spirits. They can be of people, places, times, groups, and they're supposed to be somewhat limitless in number. So even though in our Western culture we sometimes talk about the ghost of a specific person, in the world of Shinto, kami can be associated with all kinds of abstract objects. You can have the ghost of a time period or a waterfall or of a family, including those of individuals, but also of these more abstract collectivities. And there's a sense that you're supposed to revere, respect, and honor the kami because they're always around and present in the world. So the origin story of Japan, according to Shinto mythology. So Izanagi and Izanami are 2 sort of primordial gods that are claimed to exist in Shinto religious texts. So Izanagi is the male god and Izanami is the female goddess. They exist in a part of time where the world was not yet formed and there was just this kind of formless mass. They dip a spear into this formless jelly-like mass, and that creates the original main island of Japan. And then they become aware of their genders and have children, and these children form out the remaining islands of the Japanese archipelago. The last child that Izanami births, though, is a fire god, and that causes her to be burned, which burns her badly and then sends her into the underworld. Izanagi goes there to rescue her, but in the efforts to find her, he almost dies himself, and he ends up having to leave. When he leaves, he seats in a river, and when he's in the river, he gives rise to a couple of other fundamental Shinto figures. For example, as I'm seeing it here, he ventures into the underworld called Yomi, the land of the dead, in an attempt to retrieve his wife. He was told not to look at her, but when he did, he saw her kind of in a hideous demonic form because she was kind of decomposing. He escapes with his life barely, and he purifies himself in the high river. As he's washing himself, the sun goddess Amaterasu is born from his left eye, and the moon god Tsukuyomi is born from his right eye. Now, Amaterasu becomes the supreme deity, the sun goddess that's born from the left eye of Izanagi. And then, according to legend anyway, Amaterasu has a descendant that is the first actual human emperor of Japan. And this is supposed to provide a kind of connection or link between the gods and then the imperial clans of Japan that end up becoming the emperors who rule. So this is also supposed to somehow connect legitimacy to rule from the current day leadership all the way back to the creations of the universe. Okay, next. So the story of the kami Amaterasu and her link to the Japanese imperial family. I guess I just kind of said that in passing by mentioning her at the tail end of the origin story of Japan in Shinto mythology. So Amaterasu, sun goddess, born from the left eye of Izanagi, and it's claimed that her descendant, Jimmu, is the first emperor, and that establishes the imperial line of Japan. Okay, the concept of Mappo and how it relates to Pure Land Buddhism. So Pure Land Buddhism, as we talked about earlier, is this version of Buddhism which says that you can be given grace by Amida Buddha if you pray to them, especially at the end of your life, by saying, I place my faith in Amida Buddha. And then you emerge after death in the Pure Land, which is a sort of more serene and peaceful location for you to pursue your ultimate enlightenment from there. Now, Mappo is this concept related to that, which is this view. Mappo is a concept that we've entered an age of chaos where we're detached from law and order and moral goodness. So according to that view, it's very hard for us to attain our own enlightenment in this kind of fallen world, which is rife with Mappo. So it offers us an alternative to, taking the difficult path of becoming well enlightened through study or knowledge by simply being granted grace by the Amida Buddha and going to the Pure Land. So Mappo, the belief that we're living in a kind of fallen age of chaos and strife, making it almost not totally impossible, but highly difficult to attain enlightenment in ordinary means through practices of, transcendental meditation and what have you. So that means that there's an even greater basis to believe in or to support the Pure Land version, so that you don't have to, that you get a second round of attempts basically to reach enlightenment from the Pure Land, where there's no Mappo. Okay, the Ise shrine of the Shinto religion. So there's a lot of important shrines in Shinto that are built around the recognition or reverence of important kami or deities. The Ise shrine is a complex of shrines near the coast southeast of Nara in Japan, obviously. And it's dedicated to the sun goddess that I was just mentioning, which is the highest goddess in the Shinto tradition of Amaterasu. One thing that's very unique about it is that ever since the 7th century, every building in the shrine complex is completely rebuilt every 20 years from top to bottom for every piece of wood, which kind of is interesting because that means that it's simultaneously old, but also it's always new, since it's in a constant state of refurbishment and redevelopment. And I think that kind of helps to capture the essence of the shifting sands below us that we try to navigate as we make progress towards our own enlightenment in these religious traditions. Okay, so next up, the concept of tatame in Japanese religious thought. So tatame is the idea of face. It's a complex idea which involves the way that you present to your family and to society, the face that you put forward to others, basically. If you do something that dishonors yourself, your family, or your employer, or whatever, or your society, then you lose face, you lose tatame. So there's this heavy emphasis on not shaming the social collectives that you're a member of, and bringing honor to them. So to try and enforce good order and good conduct, this emphasis on the idea of tatame is kind of central in Japanese religious thought. Going next, the genre of writing known as the Imperial Chronicle. So the Imperial Chronicle is an attempt to give legitimacy to the current imperial rulers by writing these narratives that connect their lives to the prehistory of Japan in this case. But there's also imperial chronicles that were written in the Chinese religious traditions, and Japanese authors kind of appropriated the genre of writing to generate an established fundamental legitimacy of their own imperial groups. Okay. The concept of wa. All right, so wa has to do with acting in harmony with society and with other people. For example, rules governing human behavior are considered necessary for the maintenance of wa. Wa is inherent in nature and human relationships. It's a kind of benign harmony between human relationships and society. So this kind of social and familial harmony is expressed in Japanese thought as wa, and anything that interferes with or disrupts wa is bad. Okay. Finally, we get to the last bracket of questions, which ask about some of the arguments that we looked at toward the end of the semester here about the existence of God. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about each of those points. Number 75 says, what are some of the attributes that are often associated with God? So in talking about the being of God, a few of the classical attributes are omnipotent, meaning having all power; omniscience, meaning having infinite knowledge; omnibenevolence, which means being infinitely good; and then omnipresence, which means being present at all places and times. So again, God is supposed to be the most high being, the unlimited, greatest conceivable being, and a summation of those kind of qualities are that cluster of features: all powerful, all knowing, all good, and all present. Okay, next up, Anselm's ontological argument. Okay, so Saint Anselm was a Christian theologian who lived in the 11th century. He wrote a book called The Proslogion where he argued that God exists. And the basic nature of the argument is this. He says everybody already knows that the definition of God is the greatest conceivable being. Whether you believe in him or not, you know that that's the idea of God. So then he says that since God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, he has to exist in both the mind and in reality. Because if he only existed in the mind, then he wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being. So that would be a contradiction. Therefore, simply on the basis of the definition of God, we establish that he exists, because it's greater to exist in reality than to not exist in reality. And therefore, if you're the greatest conceivable being, you have to exist in both, and therefore you're real. Next up, what are three positions on the question of God's existence? So when it comes to whether God exists, most people, I think, do believe in God, but not everyone. So there's different views. Some people are theists, which means they believe in the existence of a God. And a theist can be of any different religion. It could be a Christian, Jew, Muslim, whatever. As long as they believe in God, they're a theist. On the other hand, the opposite, there's atheists. And an atheist is a person that does not believe in God for whatever basic reason. And then a third potential position, which is like somewhere in the middle of those, is the agnostic, who says that they neither affirm nor deny the existence of God, because to them, the evidence is not good enough to prove or to disprove whether God exists. So we have believers, theists; non-believers, atheists; and the sort of middle ground, undecided folks who neither declare nor reject that God exists because of their perceived lack of sufficient evidence. Okay, what's the principle of sufficient reason? The principle of sufficient reason is this concept that whatever's true, there had to be a cause for it. So for everything that exists, there must be a cause or explanation for it. That's a basic principle of logic and life, that when something exists, something had to cause it to exist. Just like you exist, but only because your parents gave birth to you, and so forth, and on and on. Now, Richard Taylor's cosmological argument. This is a classic argument in philosophy that tries to express the existence of God. So the cosmological argument basically says this: everything has a cause. The universe exists, so it has to have a cause. And what could the cause of the universe be? It can't be a part of the universe, nor could it be something else that needs to have a cause, because that would simply lead to an infinite sequence of causes, and we would never get to the beginning. So since there must be a first cause, the first cause of the universe must be God, something that causes everything else, but does not need a cause itself. In the more technical way of putting it, there's two types of truths. There's contingent and necessary truths. Contingent truths are things that are true, but they could have been false, like, for example, the fact that you're watching this. And a necessary truth is something that's true no matter what, like 2 + 2 = 4. So the universe and everything within it appears to be contingent. And according to the principle of sufficient reason that we just mentioned, that means that everything that is contingent has to have a cause. So if the universe exists and it's contingent, it has to have a cause. But what the cause of the universe is can't be contingent. Otherwise, there would be causes on causes to infinity, and an infinite regress, they say, is impossible. So the first cause has to be something that's not contingent. In other words, a necessary being, and that's God. Taylor gives an example of a sphere in the forest when he makes his argument. He says, imagine that a person encountered randomly a sphere about their same height while they were taking a walk in the woods. Obviously, if you saw something as weird as that, you'd probably pause for a moment to be like, what is that doing here, and how did it ever get here? What's the cause of it being here, basically? And he just uses this example to supply the idea to us that if something exists, there had to be a cause for it. And then that's like the first plank of his argument, because beyond that, he continues to say that the universe, just as much as this weird example of the sphere, is a thing that exists. And so just like the sphere, the universe has to have a cause too. And in the end, he's going to say it's God that caused the universe. Okay, William Paley's argument from design. Paley said that anything that's complex and functional has to have an intelligent creator. He uses the example of a watch to make that point, knowing that a watch has complexity and it can't just come together without someone intentionally crafting it for telling time. He makes that conclusion that something as complex as a watch had to have an intelligent creator because it's too functional to happen by accident. So then he says there's also things in nature, though, that are just as sophisticated and functional as the watch, or even maybe more so, like the wings of the bird or the eyes that you're using to see this video or the ears that you're using to hear it. So those things are natural, but they're also functional and complex. If a watch had to have a watchmaker, he thinks that the eye or whatever and other natural things like it would also have to have some kind of intelligent creator. And that's the idea that God had to be that creator. In mentioning this, I guess, told you about the analogy of the watch and the eye, so we can keep moving to the next thing. We're getting to the very end. So Pascal's wager. Blaise Pascal lived in the 1600s, and he wrote about an argument that said you should just believe in God even if you can't prove it. In his argument, he says no one can prove whether God exists or not, but let's just suppose that you have to make a choice one way or the other. So if you have to choose whether to believe, the question is, what's the risky and what's the least risky choice? He says if you believe in God, it's way safer because believing in God means you might be right, and if you are, you'll go to heaven. And if you're not right, then I guess no big loss. But suppose that you don't believe in God, there's really nothing to benefit from, at least he says, because if you don't believe in God and there is a God, then I guess you might be punished with hell or denied the rewards of heaven. And if you didn't believe in God and you're correct, you really don't gain anything. So he thinks that by believing, it's all potential benefit and no real loss. But by not believing, it's all potential loss with no great benefit. So anybody that's just risk averse and reasonable should rather believe in God than not, just as a way of not exposing themselves to the possible threat or risk of going to hell in case they're wrong. Of course, this argument is presented to the sort of Christian version of God that judges people and dispenses with them in the afterlife by sending them to heaven or hell. But that's, he wrote to a Christian audience. He's a French philosopher of the 1600s. So that's Pascal's wager. The analogy between a coin flip and choosing whether to believe in God, he says, well, when you flip a coin, you know it's going to land heads or tails, but you don't know which one until it lands. And in the same way, he says, with God's existence, you know that he either exists or he doesn't. That's like the two sides of the coin. But you don't know which one it is, and you can't find out. So you have to make a call, just like when you flip a coin and you're doing a bet, you have to choose heads or tails without knowing for sure which one it would be. And he thinks in the same sense, you have to choose whether to believe in God or not, even though you can't know what's actually the case, whether he does or not, does not exist. And then he continues from there to say that as long as you can't prove which one it is, you just rather should believe because it's a safer bet. Now, what's a criticism of the ontological argument? There are different criticisms. One criticism is that um, how could existence be considered an attribute? Some people think that if you say the greatest conceivable being has to exist, that means that you're treating existence like it's a quality of something. But arguably, it's not an attribute of anything. That something exists or doesn't exist is not an attribute. If I say a dog is brown, that's an attribute of the dog. But if I say the dog exists, that's not really an attribute of the dog. So some people attack it in that way. Other people say the problem is that you could just make up anything that is the greatest conceivable whatever and then claim it exists, but it obviously doesn't. If I told you that there's a greatest conceivable island and then I conclude that it has to exist just based on the definition, you'd know that that's not necessarily true. So another attack on the argument is assuming that God has to exist because he's just defined as the greatest conceivable being doesn't really necessarily prove that he does. Now, next, what's a critique of the cosmological argument? Okay, so there's a whole range of criticisms of the cosmological argument, the one that says everything has a cause, so the universe has to have a cause. One objection is, if everything had to have a cause, why wouldn't God have to have one? That seems to be inconsistent. Another objection is, if God doesn't have to have a cause, then why does the universe have to have a cause? I mean, maybe it could have no cause. Isn't that possible? Another issue is, how come it's not possible to have an infinite regress of causes? The argument says that's impossible, and therefore God had to be the first cause in the series. But how come it's impossible for there to be an infinite sequence of causes that just never gets to the end? After all, in math, there's no limit to the numbers that you can use when you're dividing something in half. So why can't the timeline of causes also be infinite? And who said that everything has to have a cause anyway? So these are all criticisms of the cosmological argument. Nagel, Ernest Nagel is the author who talked about this in our lecture. He also has criticisms for the argument from design. One criticism is, so the real reason that we know that the watch and the eye have a creator is different. Or let me say that again. The real reason that we know that the watch has a creator is not because it has a function. The reason that we know that the watch has a creator is because we make the watches. And when we turn our attention to the eye, which is being compared in the author's argument to the watch, the fact that the eye has a function can be explained on a whole different basis. You can explain the existence of things in nature with a function like eyes, ears, wings, nose, or anything else through evolution and the natural selection process. That does not assume that there's a divine creator that's guiding the process of evolution. So although the watch and the eye were compared by the author, you could say that though they each have a function, that's where the similarities end. The function of the watch is irrelevant to the knowledge that it had a creator, and the function of the eye can be explained without any essential reference to a creator, instead through evolution. Finally, an objection to Pascal's wager. So you could argue there's a few things wrong with the Pascal wager. One is, how do you really know that God would reward the believer and punish the non-believer, even if God did exist? Aren't we just sort of making an assumption there? It could be that God doesn't necessarily care whether we believed in him or not. After all, if he wanted us to believe in him, he could make it easier for everybody to do by simply revealing himself in a way that would be indisputable to everyone. So if God didn't care whether we believed in him or not, then the assumption underlying Pascal's argument that you're at risk if you don't believe in God and you stand to benefit if you do might not be true. So that's one big problem right there. Some people also say, how do we know which God it is that we're supposed to be working towards finding favor with? After all, if I was to believe in one God and a different God was the true God, then possibly I might not really win the favor of the true God if I even did believe. So yeah, we see those issues with the Pascal wager. There's also this other problem. Some say it's not really good to believe in something without sufficient evidence. Pascal tells you should believe in God, even though you can't prove it just because you hope you're right. And some people say that's not the right basis to believe in something. You need firm evidence. Otherwise, you're kind of committing a sin against logic. You're only supposed to believe in things that are well supported by evidence, not just because you hope they're true. And finally, the last question asks about the problem of evil. So one argument that's given to try and disprove the existence of God, on the other hand, is the problem of evil. And it's a simple enough argument. It says, if God existed, he would be perfectly good and powerful, which means that he would not allow for there to be evil because he would have all the power to stop it. And being good, he would want to stop it. but the argument continues to mention there is evil in the world. Think of all the terrible things happening: war, murder, rape, torture, genocide. So there's so many bad things happening in the world. You could argue that if God existed, he wouldn't allow this. So therefore, there must not be a God, because if there was God, there wouldn't be evil, but there is evil. So again, the argument says if God existed, there'd be no evil in the world, but there is evil in the world. So therefore, God must not exist. So I just have now given you a quick, very rushed crash course by design, though. I didn't want to, take away too much of your own ability to study, and just have a brief little video lesson here. So this has been a review session for our final exam. I'll be in touch with you guys as we get closer to the day of Thursday, but thanks so much for watching. It's been a great semester teaching you guys. I'm wishing you all the best this summer beyond the class and in life. And if you need me at all, just let me know. But I'm signing out for now. Have a good one, and I'll hear from you soon.